Shabbat Shalom. In most parts of the world, it's reasonably understood that MD stands for medical doctor. But in this tiny sliver of the world known as From Yeshivish podcasts, of which I frequent on occasion, MD means something entirely different. Okay, are you ready? There's really no going back from this. MD stands for Mitzvah Density. Mitzvah Density is a formula that divides the number of commandments in a parsha by the total number of verses in that parsha, and then for no good reasons multiplies the number by 100. The overall MD of the Torah, thank you for asking, is 613 mitzvot divided by 5,846 verses times 100. On average, 10.5 mitzvot for every 100 verses of Torah. So, you can imagine the glee in the podcaster's voice when he reported that this week's Parsha, Kedoshim, has a mitzvah density of 79.7. That's 51 mitzvot in only 64 verses. That's the highest MD in the whole Torah. Jonathan, did you realize that you'd hit the jackpot? Now, any effort to enumerate mitzvot, like Rambam's Sefer Mitzvot or the 13th century Sefer Chinuch, is actually more complicated than it might seem, and this week's Parsha gives us a perfect example. The opening verse of Kedoshim instructs the people, Kedoshim tihiyu, ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokechem. You shall be holy, for I, God, am holy. And then one mitzvah after the next, ranging significantly in their subject matter, ritual mitzvot, ethical mitzvot, interpersonal, intrapersonal, etc. So the question that commentators and codifiers alike had to deal with is, what is going on with you shall be holy? Is it a commandment in its own right, or is it an introduction, a framing for what comes next? Is this the Torah's way of saying, all that follows is how one fulfills the general exhortation to be holy, or is it a message in and of itself? Most of the voices who weigh in claim that be holy isn't an independent mitzvah. It's the bracket that encloses this section of Torah, an idea supported by the fact that the closing verse of the parsha is also V'hitem li kedoshim ki kadosh ani Hashem. You shall be holy to me, for I, God, am holy. In other words, everything in between the topic sentence and the conclusion fills in the specifics of how to be holy. Holiness is achieved by living the life prescribed by the commandments in the Torah. To be holy means doing what the Torah tells you to do. But Nachmanides, the 13th century Spanish teacher, takes a very different approach. He says, you can follow every commandment in the Torah and still be, in his words, Naval birshut haTorah, a scoundrel with the permission of the Torah. It's a remarkable phrase, to my knowledge, invented by Nachmanides. Think about what he's saying. It's not enough to follow the letter of the law. A Naval birshut haTorah mistakenly believes that he can keep kosher while eating in a way that degrades the planet, the workers, and himself. That he can collect a loan that's due to him while condemning the borrower to a life of poverty. That he can behave in a way that is permissible by the standards of a court of law, but detestable in the realm of human behavior. That he can fulfill the task but miss the point. And therefore, Nachmanides asserts, the Torah says, you shall be holy. It's the Torah's way of acknowledging the limits of its own language, of resisting a reduction of its message to a list of do's and don'ts. To be holy means approaching any situation with an earnest desire to do not just what's permitted, but what's right. Don't be, he says, a Naval birshut haTorah, a scoundrel with the permission of the Torah. Now, Nachmanides might have invented this phrase, but the language he chose calls forward an old story that adds a layer of intrigue to this idea. The Hebrew word Naval, in addition to meaning scoundrel or impious or disgraceful, is also the name of a character in the book of Samuel. Here's his story. Naval was a wealthy man, 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, a big enough flock that they had to spread out all over the country to graze. When it came time to shear his sheep, a joyous and festive occasion for the wealthy, word spread across the land, reaching none other than a young David. At this point in the story, he's been anointed by the prophet Samuel, but he's not yet king. In fact, he and his small band of men are barely surviving. King Saul and his army are consistently in pursuit of David, this game of cat and mouse, indicating Saul's reluctance to relinquish his throne. David and his men seem to be making a living protecting other people's flocks, including Naval's sheep, from robbers and wild beasts. So, when David gets word that Naval was about to shear his sheep, he sends his men to deliver the following message. Your shepherds, Naval, they were with us, and no harm befell them, and nothing went missing all the days that they were protected by my men. Deal graciously with us, giving us whatever you can. The tone of the message is polite and subservient to David's attempt to appeal to Naval's better nature. Listen to Naval's response. Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? These days, many are the slaves breaking away from their masters. Should I take my bread and my water and my meat that I slaughtered from my shearers and give it to men from I know not where? Analyzing this scene, Moshe Halbertal writes, Naval could have justifiably argued that he never asked for the services provided by David's armed band of drifters and therefore had no intention of paying for alleged protection services. Yet Naval's refusal to fork over the requested gifts seethed with class superiority and insolence. Naval Birshut HaTorah. While he might not have been legally required to pay David for services he never requested, he didn't need to respond with callousness and cruelty. It's hard not to hear in the language of Naval's response a swipe at David's origins, a delegitimization of his identity, maybe even his right to the crown, based on who his ancestors are. David is the grandson of Oved, which means slave, the descendant of Peretz, which means break away. So listen again to Naval's words. Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? These days, many are the slaves, Avadim, like Oved, breaking away, Hamit Partzim, like Peretz, from their masters. In Naval's world, David is little more than a runaway slave who does not deserve to share in the rich man's plenty. The scene quickly escalates. David and 400 of his men grab their swords and set off, vowing to kill Naval and every male member of his household. Here, the text echoes with that encounter back in Genesis, when Esav and his 400 men are on their way to Jacob, the first time they'll reunite after Jacob stole his brother's firstborn blessing. The identification here is chilling. David with Esav. Both men who feel as if something has been stolen from them and their identities belittled. But of course, in these two stories, it's only David with the murderous intent, a flashing warning through identification and then divergence, that David alone is on the precipice of catastrophic action. And yet, emerging between the violent rage of David and the selfish cruelty of Naval is a voice that cuts through the madness. Avigail, wife of Naval, learns about what's transpired and sets off with the gifts of bread and meat her husband had refused to give, hoping to intercept David and his men before this catastrophe unfolds. Her speech is a masterclass in diplomacy. She is humble and persuasive, owns the wrongs Naval has committed, offers the gifts as recompense, asks for forgiveness and prays for his safety, and then, most importantly, appeals to his moral sensibility. Listen to her words. When the Lord has accomplished for you all the good that God has promised you and has appointed you ruler of Israel, don't let this moment be one of faltering courage or a stumbling block of the heart to have shed blood needlessly. Remember who you are, David, and who you're meant to be. Don't throw it all away. In the words of Moshe Halbertal, Israel's future legitimate king must carefully distinguish himself from the random chieftain of some desert-crawling protection racket. He must be discriminating and virtuous. He must refrain from blotting his record with unnecessary bloodshed. David turns to Abigail, heart softened by her urgent message, and says to her, Baruch Hashem, asher shilachecha yom hazeh likrati. Thank God, who sent you to meet me this day. Ubaruch tamech, blessed is your good sense. Ubrucha at, and blessed are you. Asher kilitini hayom hazeh mibo midamim. For you restrained me today from bloodshed. This is the story that Nachmanides whispers and weaves into our understanding of holiness, of what it means to avoid the path of the Naval. In this story, the Naval is represented not just by its namesake, but by David as well, by two men hurling forward on a collision course, each trapped by their grievance, each believing that their cruel behavior is justified by what's owed to them, even if ultimately immoral. But it's more than that. The tragic mistake of the Naval is his belief that the options in front of him are the only options that exist, that all the cards have been played, and it's just a matter of picking up the right one, that the 613 mitzvot are all that's needed to fulfill the aspirational message, you shall be holy. But he's wrong. He's wrong. Holiness is Abigail bursting onto the scene, reminding David that there are choices beyond what he's considered. Holiness is her insistence that the future can be different from the present. Holiness, Nachmanides understood, is seeing beyond the page, beyond the letter, beyond the do's and don'ts, and into a realm that is yet to be defined. Holiness is recognizing that what looks like the whole story is always, necessarily, only part of the story. The punctuation of life isn't a period, it's an ellipsis. Holiness is the stretch that moves us beyond what we know and what we've seen and into what we can imagine and dream. Kedoshim tihiyu ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokechem. You shall be holy, for I, God, am holy. Shabbat shalom.